Hi, welcome to another episode of the Akiona Law Podcast. I am Ululani Akiona, and in this podcast, we talk about anything and everything that intersects in the world of family law and divorce. And today we are continuing our multi-part series with divorce coach and co-parenting coach extraordinaire, Meg Gluckman. Welcome, Meg, back to the show.
Hi, Lani. Good to be here. Love chatting with you.
Me too. And for those of you who didn't listen to our first episode of this multi-part recording about parenting plans, Meg is a divorce and co-parenting coach. She's host of Welcome to the Other Side podcast. She specializes in supporting parents, whether they have toddlers, tweens, or 30 somethings navigate challenging life transitions with grace and resilience. And in the first podcast, we talked about creating a residential schedule and a parenting plan and a holiday schedule. So go back and listen to that one. And today we're going to talk about decision making. Big
Yeah,
stuff.
it
Decision
is big
making.
stuff. Yeah, it is big stuff. It's one of the required areas in the parenting plan. The state, the court wants you to make a decision about at least two key decision-making areas, but you can include many more, whether it's going to be a joint decision or a sole decision. And so we want to talk about those required decisions, but then also what are a lot of optional categories of decisions that you might include in your parenting plan?
Right. And just to kind of define some things, joint decision making means that if something comes up in a parenting plan, and the two major areas Meg is talking about for decision making has to do with school education decisions and healthcare, non-emergency healthcare. So for example, when we talk about joint or sole decision making when it comes to school, the parents have to make that decision jointly if that's what the parenting plan says. And sole decision making essentially means that one parent gets to make the decision about school. Um, these are such big topics, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's a really good point, is that the parenting plan doesn't lay out how you're going to make any decisions,
right.
right? The actual nuts and bolts of the decision. It's just saying who is going to make those decisions, right?
Mhm.
Um, Most of the folks that I work with are going through an amicable divorce process. So they're either working out the divorce between themselves, over coffee at the coffee shop. They're using a mediator to help them work through the divorce, or they're using a collaborative divorce process, which we've talked about in a previous episode as well. And so most of the folks that I work with will tend to just put down joint for
Uh-huh.
both non-emergency medical decisions and education decisions. But I know, Lonnie, that you've worked with some folks and know the context where that's not always appropriate. Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, and you know what that has to do is in the decision-making section of a parenting plan, restrictions can be imposed on one parent's decision making where so let's say for example, dad has an alcohol or drug problem. And that's a basis why restrictions could be placed on dad's decision-making ability, where maybe mom would have sole decision-making until dad gets some sort of treatment and help for, and he shows for an extended period of time that he's able to maintain his sobriety, his recovery. Um, but so, and that's real, and that happens more as you were saying, Meg, maybe more in terms of the litigated contested cases, unless I haven't come across this yet where parents are doing a collaborative divorce where alcohol, substance abuse is a problem. And so the parents work together to craft this parenting plan, taking into consideration the other parent's struggle with maybe alcohol abuse, which I frankly think is just a beautiful process to go through with collaborative divorce. It shows a real type of caring and concern to kind of hold that struggling parent with addiction, because addiction is a disease. But I'm digressing. Going
Well, but
on.
I love that. Thank you for pointing that out. Again, we're just speaking to the creativity that can come
Yeah,
in a collaborative divorce process. It might be helpful just to elaborate for folks a little bit on what might fall under the categories
yeah,
of education and non-emergency medical decisions, right?
right.
So for education, that might be, choosing schools, um, getting on an IEP or some sort of support plan at schools. For non-medical decisions, we're talking about things like not regular like well child appointments, per se, but things like counseling, um, going through a diagnostic process to see if someone, has ADHD or something like that. And sometimes
Allergies, right? Allergy
allergies. Oh,
testing.
that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And never including here, of course, emergency medical decisions, right? So the idea being that whoever the child is with, if there is an emergency, we're just trusting that parent to do what's appropriate. We're not going to pause and wait for a decision-making process. You know,
Right.
kid falls down on the playground, breaks his arm, like you're going to take him to the emergency room and get a cast, and that's appropriate. Is
You
there
know what's
anything you want to add there? Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I was going to add in. I was going to add in a really good example of a non-emergency medical decision making is vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right? So again, what it might say, if it's called out specifically, and we'll get into um, those are kind of can get into more optional decision making too, is it might say that vaccinations are going to be decided jointly by the parents, right? Again, we're not going to specify necessarily in this section what will be decided, but just that both parents might, have the responsibility of making the decisions.
And here's something too that I want to mention about the educational decision. A lot of times private schools come up,
Mm-hmm.
and that is something that has to be a joint decision because of the cost that
Right.
incurs with private school. And the court is not about to force a child, or what I'm trying to say is that a parent isn't going to necessarily force the court isn't going to necessarily force a parent to pay for private school education just
Right.
because one parent thinks it's going to be in the child's best interest. That is something that has to be a joint decision. And if a parent who wants a child to go to private school strongly feels that this has to happen, I've been in situations where that parent says, I will pay for it 100% then. So that's
Yeah.
that's another example. Um,
Mhm.
what are some, is there anything you kind of want to expound about in terms of school education, or do we want to?
I think that kind of covers it, right? I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the other
Yeah.
optional decision-making areas that you can include but don't have to include in the decision-making section. Um,
And that's where people come to you, right?
Yeah, and I want to say that sometimes and I will always recommend that folks talk with their attorney about um, whether what they want to include is actually enforceable,
Oh,
right?
good
Is
point.
court enforceable? Because there are things that we want to decide that can just be an agreement, especially folks that are working amicably together, right? That can just be an agreement between both parents. And so sometimes what I have folks do is they have things that they're going to include in their parenting plan to just like make sure it's in the legal document, and if it ever needed to be enforced, it could be enforced. But then they also make a co-parenting agreement. That's more of like these are our intentions,
Okay.
right? These are things that are important to us. So we can kind of talk about what might go in each one. But coming back to the kind of decisions that might be in the parenting plan, right? And again, we're just going to talk about who makes the decision. So we're not going to specify in the parenting plan what the end decision is, but just who makes it, right? So for instance, extracurricular activities. That's like a really big one, right? Who's going to decide, um, how many sports the kids play each season, or whether, whatever those extracurriculars are, right? Um, that's one that a lot of folks like to work out and make sure it's a joint decision. I see lots of folks want to put in something about driving. So,
Driving.
right, when will
Mhm.
when will the kid take driver's ed? What are the thoughts around, getting a license and so forth?
Mhm.
Um, Also around cell phones,
I know.
right?
That's next to my
Lots
head. Cell phones,
lots of
huge.
things about cell phones, right? Um, Not only what kind, is it a smartphone or is it just a flip flow phone? Is there social media on it? Social media is now coming up more and more,
Right.
as we learn some of the negative impacts on social media on teens and tweens. Um, Daycare comes up. So daycare is definitely something that is talked about, or childcare can be talked about in the child support order, which is a whole nother document that we're not even getting into here today. But this might also be an area in the parenting plan where you're making decisions about how you'll decide on childcare or daycare.
Yeah, and
Um,
summer camps falls under that too.
Summer camps.
Big one.
Woo!
Such a
So
big one.
big. Or just like that summer childcare in general, right?
Yeah.
Like how are we going to decide that? Um, I've seen ones about passports.
Oh,
I've seen ones
yeah.
about international travel,
Yeah.
right? How are we going to make decisions around that? Firearms classes,
Oh,
hunter
wow.
hunter safety kind of
Yeah.
classes, those kind of things.
Good one.
Um, so again, it's really just kind of putting out there in the parenting plan, how are we going to make these, who's going to make these decisions? In the work that I do with folks, we actually dive deeper into, okay, so what is the decision? What is the process that you want to go through? Let's take summer camps, for instance, right? What is the
Okay.
process that we're actually going to decide on
Mhm.
summer camps? You know, who's going to decide? When in the year do we decide? Working through all of those like nitty-gritty details of
Uh-huh.
figuring it out. Um, those nitty-gritty details are not going to show up in the parenting plan.
Right. That's going to show up in
Especially,
the
yeah,
co-parenting agreement.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And especially too, if you're dealing with, you know, a 6-year-old
Yeah.
and you're thinking about how we're going to decide about summer camp versus, okay, knowing in 5 years and they're 11 and they want to do something totally different, or what. So you're going to need a dynamic process that allows you to adjust to the changes in your family as your kids age and go through different stages.
You know what I like about this in the sense of the discussion that we're having is that in terms of the parenting plan, right? It's almost like broad strokes
Yes.
because you can't get into the nitty-gritty with the parenting plan because the court doesn't want you to be entering like a 40-page parenting plan. It's just too
No.
much. So you do
Right.
the broad strokes, and then the parties are working with you to hammer out those nitty-gritty finer details to put in a co-parenting agreement.
Yeah. The court doesn't want you to come back in and say, um, you know, what's a good one uh to do? Oh, people want to put in screen time,
Screen
right?
time.
And I'm like, no, we're
Oh
not
yeah.
putting screen time into the parenting plan because if you say, oh, I don't want my 5-year-old to have more than 20 minutes of screen time a day, and my ex is giving them an hour of screen time a day, a court doesn't want you to come in and say,
Force that.
enforce. They're like, no, no, right? So that's where, like,
Right,
okay,
let me
let's
jump
come
in really
out.
quickly. And
Hmm.
that's because the court doesn't want to be micromanaging parents.
Hmm.
That's why they don't do it. Same thing as like they don't that's almost like putting your parenting plan, right? My child has to eat 2 servings of broccoli every
Yeah.
single day.
Yeah.
Now I want to go into court and enforce that part of the parenting plan because that
Yes.
other parent just feeds my kid pizza and
Right.
chips and cookies.
Yes. Yeah. And so the court looks at those things as their day-to-day kind of minor
Mm.
trivial decisions, right? These are little decisions that each parent gets to make,
Gets to make in their household.
right? They really do. They really do. And the kind of boundary for it is those decisions don't necessarily have a long-term impact on the kid. They don't have a long-term impact on the other parent's relationship with the kid,
Right.
right? And they're not incurring any cost to the other parent,
Oh,
right? So when you brought up like extracurriculars or summer camps or sorry, you brought up private school as the
yeah.
example, right? That a court doesn't want to say, okay, parent A wants private school, parent B doesn't, but we're going to make parent B pay for it. Um, Similarly, like you can make all these minor day-to-day decisions as your own parent as long as there's no cost, that you're incurring for the other parent without their agreement to it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
in terms of the, like, I have, in terms of like the, extracurricular activities,
Yeah.
there also has to be that consideration where you can't have a child so busy in extracurricular activities that it's interfering with the other parent's time, and two, that it's interfering with the child's ability to do homework. So
Yeah.
there's that
Yeah.
consideration.
Extracurriculars are a really big conversation topic with me and my clients.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
because we have to work it out, especially if there's different values, right?
Uh-huh.
Parents have different values about what's important, and being able to get to a place where you can come to an agreement,
Okay.
right? And sometimes what's necessary too is coming to an agreement for now. For the
Hmm.
age and the stage that our kids are at, what is our agreement? Versus trying to come to an agreement for forever, right?
Right.
And so uh sometimes folks use this description of having a co-parenting business meeting, right?
Oh,
Like they'll
right.
have a regular, maybe it's a quarterly,
Yeah.
maybe it's just an annual co-parenting business
Right.
meeting where they come together and they make these kind of decisions like, okay, what are we thinking for the next year of
Right.
extracurricular activities? What are we thinking for summer camp going
Right.
forward, right? What's coming up for you? What are your, oh,
Hmm.
like you're thinking you want to do this big adventure during the summer, and how is that going to impact, signing up for summer camps when they open and so forth. So that can be a really useful tool is to actually build in the structure of like, okay, we're going to decide a year at a time
Yeah.
on these issues.
I
Yeah.
like that too, especially too with extracurricular activities. I mean, it's such a big issue. I mean, like I've have two boys, and one of them, soccer was a thing. The other one,
Mhm.
he didn't. As with with younger kids, right? You put them into so many different sports until hopefully they find one that they like. And with my
Yeah.
youngest, it was baseball, then it was
Mhm.
soccer, then it was tennis.
Yeah.
So I can definitely see the importance and the value of having annual co-parent business-like meetings to be okay. Well, Johnny did soccer last year. I think Johnny wants to continue playing soccer, or
Mhm.
Johnny wants to play soccer, and in the off season, Johnny wants to do flag football or something. Swimming, maybe.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and their interests, like you're saying, they ebb and flow, and what's going on for the parents ebbs and flows too.
Right.
There might have been a time when it was really easy for you to juggle
Right.
carpooling and taking kids to multiple practices a week, and you have a job change and that makes it harder and so forth. And so
Right.
having a check-in around
Yeah.
it, can be really, really useful. Um,
Yeah, it's stressful. These dang kids and their activities, man.
yeah,
Stressful.
yeah,
Taking them to and from practices and games.
yeah. It's a full-time job or a part-time, an additional part-time job,
Yeah, it's additional
right?
part-time job.
And part of what comes along with this too is the cost,
The
right? So
cost.
you're
Right.
doing all of these, right? So there is a decision making around who's going to pay for what, right?
Mhm.
And part of that is going to be again included in the child support order of what that covers and how some costs are divided. But a lot of times folks will include how things are going to be, how we're going to share extra costs beyond what child support covers, sometimes in the parenting plan as well.
You know what? You know this co-parenting agreement arrangement. Like I've seen it come up before, but
Hmm.
um, is it that's just between the parents themselves, right? Or would the parents maybe slap on a cover sheet on it and file it with court?
I'm sure folks have filed it
Yeah,
as
the
well,
cover sheet.
you know, as a addendum or as an attachment.
Right.
I don't know what the right legal term is, right? And I think we were also going to take some time in maybe a future podcast talking about section, oh my gosh, I'm blanking
Other
now.
section
Yeah, the
14, other.
section 14.
Yeah.
It just went out, the number went out of my head. Section 14. So some of that stuff might
Yeah.
fall into section 14 as well. Um, and but really it's about, you know, so much as we kind of navigate from parenting synchronously, right? We're like parenting together to parenting kind of asynchronously and doing more of this co-parent piece where we, you know, there's just a lot more communication, especially at first, that's necessary to kind of keep things flowing smoothly. We can make a lot of assumptions around what the other person might think about regarding decisions or, you know, say the extracurriculars.
Mhm.
Doing something like the co-parenting agreement is
Yeah.
helpful because it's just like, let's just get it down on paper.
Let's get that.
Let's have it documented that we both agree. You know, like I'll give an example from my co-parenting. You know, we
Oh,
decided up front that um, one sport a season,
one sport a season?
right? Like it was like one thing at a time.
Wait, wait, wait. But
So
what if your child wants to do two sports?
yeah. So the agreement is
Okay.
that we will both support one sport a season
Okay.
automatically. So
Okay.
like if the kid decides it's baseball this season, great. If it's soccer this season, great. So we don't have to like go back and forth about that one. If there's a second thing that comes on, then either one of us can say no.
Mm.
Like it's not a good fit. Like I can't handle that much more, and then it's a no. Right?
That's
But we might both say yes and great, we can do it. So just like having creating that base agreement was super helpful for us.
okay.
Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
good example.
Yeah. What from your experience, Lonnie, where do the decisions about paying for extra things like the extra, you know, the special soccer seasons or, you know, the special trip that is, you know, the French club is doing something like that. Where does that come in? Where do you see people put that decision making process or how we're going to split those costs?
You know, that's a really good question. And of course, we're talking about club soccer, premier soccer, which
Yeah.
my oldest was involved in. And yeah, you know, when you're talking about the trips too, like there's a tournament in Vegas every year. Um, but and so in terms of that, I've put it in the child support order,
Hmm.
but I've also seen it done as how you're talking about when we're doing collaborative divorce or agree divorces, where it's in the other section or this co-parenting agreement and it's spelled out there. Maybe just because it's just easier to have it spelled out there. But
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
I think oftentimes folks will refer back to their parenting plan more than pulling up the child
the
support
child support
order to
order.
look at it. But wherever it is, I think it's just like so helpful to like really work through. And I talk through this with some of my clients, especially after I had a couple different clients who had such a laborious process for reconciling the costs.
Yeah.
Um, right? So I think it's really important that we know exactly how costs will be divided.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and how we will reconcile, how we will settle that, right? So, like, for instance, it might just be probably one parent who pays for select soccer, right? They put it on their card and register the kid. What is the process for making sure the other parent pays back that
Mhm.
component,
The
that
reimbursement
their portion? Yeah. Yeah. Um, Getting really clear on that is
in the
super,
parenting
super
agreement.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And
Mm.
usually when parties are not in agreement, that's when I put it in the child support order.
Yeah.
Um, but in the child support order, in a way, you're kind of limited because you can't really get into the nitty gritty, especially when it
Right.
comes into select sports, because the bottom line is if one parent wants their kid to participate in select soccer and the other parent doesn't, and there's a
Yeah.
disagreement, and your fallback is mediation, and that doesn't work. And then you go to court, and then you then have to litigate sometimes, and it just comes down to this cost benefit analysis. If the
Yes.
costs that you're spending to get the other parent to pay, is it would you have just saved money if you just paid it yourself?
Yeah.
There's that. But
Mhm.
but that's why I love it when people are able to work this out via agreement and actually spell out these nitty gritties,
Mhm.
utilizing a person, parenting coach such as you.
Yeah.
Makes
Yeah.
my job
And
easier.
yeah. I think it's just, again, it comes back to, let's just make a clear process for this, right? So that you're not having to make a lot of game time decisions,
Yeah.
right? About how do we decide if we're paying for something? No, we're going to know clearly what percentage is going to be mine, what percentage is going to be the other parents, and then how does somebody get reimbursed? What's the timeline? What's the mechanism for doing that? Yeah, super helpful to get clear on it.
I want to ask you a question about other things that you have seen in terms of major decision making.
Mhm.
Okay. So back in the day, and we're talking, before the advent of people putting in cell phones
Mhm.
and social media accounts into parenting plans. Back in the day, let's just say maybe in the early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s, we had joint decision making for things like ear piercing, um,
Oh, yeah.
for haircuts,
Mhm.
military before, military,
Yep.
marriage.
Yes.
Do you
Yeah.
still see people putting that kind of stuff in?
Yeah, I think just on a couple of those, the military and the marriage are
Mm.
still like, I see them in a lot of literature, like in a lot of divorce books, right?
Yeah.
As like, and it's kind of a what did we say? CYA, like cover your ass
Mm,
um thing where it's like we don't know, especially when you have like toddlers and you're putting in this thing about, marriage before 18 or military before 18.
yeah.
We're just like, we don't know, but let's just throw it out there. So
Yeah.
I think those I'm still seeing folks put those in
Okay.
right now, just like as a cover our basis thing. Um, the ear piercings and the haircuts, I think, are good. I still see tattoos too,
Oh,
you know,
tattoos?
but tattoos, I mean, that being such a permanent
A
decision,
permanent.
right, makes sense
Yeah.
that there might be a joint decision. Um, Haircuts and piercings, and some could argue that piercing could be kind of a
Permanent.
permanent, but haircuts, um, I I just coach my clients a lot on that kind of stuff. I mean, and
Yeah.
even stepping back and saying more of like physical appearance, right? Like all your thoughts about what your child should look like, right? How they should dress. Dad sends them to school and they have wrong socks on or their shirt's inside out, right? Because a lot of times what I get to with my clients is how it reflects on them. So how their child looks and then how it reflects on them. So it's interesting to just like see if that's under the surface there for them, but really just
Interesting.
getting curious about like, so your daughter, has had long hair and she decides, she wants to shave it off.
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Assuming that there's no coercion there, right? Like
Right.
dad's not pushing her to do it, but she wants to do it.
Yeah.
What's really under that? What's the problem? So I love talking to folks about that, like just getting to what's underneath there for you.
You know what? This is always I mean, just my thought was almost like, okay, I may not like the fact, whatever, that my, like the moppy floppy hairstyle is back in.
Yes.
May not like it, but I may think my son looks better when his hair is a little bit more trimmed.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But at the same time, that's his expression. It's his individuality, it's his freedom, and children
Yeah.
need to be able to express themselves in the way that they look, especially if they're not hurting anyone. And that
Hmm.
was a source of conflict between my spouse and I at the time, because my spouse wanted our boys to have like short hair, and our boys have beautiful curls, beautiful curly hair. And in a way it would just, and when you keep it short you can't really see their beautiful curls as much, and it would just drive me bananas. Like, why are you ragging him on his hair? Why are you telling him, get a haircut, your hair looks messy, you look like. And it almost
Yeah.
kind of, I almost went back into time where in the 70s where people had this long hair, and I almost kind of felt like, hey, was Ben?
Yeah.
Hey, was Ben? What are we living in the 70s? Like, what
Yeah.
the hell?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Ah,
Yeah. I mean, I think in the reality around the haircuts, right? Um, we think it's a co-parenting issue, but it isn't.
it isn't.
It's
It
a
isn't.
parenting issue.
It's apparent.
Like it's a
Yeah.
your relationship with your child issue, right? Yeah.
But it's this, what did you say again? What's the question underneath? What is it? So for example, for my
Oh,
husband, what is it about our son having
yeah.
long moppy hair that
Mm.
bothers you?
Yeah. That's the
What's the root
question.
of that? Be
Yeah.
curious.
Yeah. Yeah. But it takes somebody who's willing to be reflective to go
Oh, okay,
there.
well, that's not my situation. Oh, boy, oh,
Uh,
boy.
yeah. So I think in summary, like I would just say there's some decisions that you're going to lay out in the parenting plan around who makes them, whether it's a joint decision or a sole decision. Um, but there are a whole lot more decisions that you can craft a co-parenting agreement or perhaps put it in section 14 that we'll talk about later. Um, that you want to address because it'll just make kind of co-parenting a lot smoother and easier to have thought through some of this stuff ahead of time.
Right. To kind of have that conscious thought structure into the business of co-parenting.
Hmm.
And that was a great summary, Meg, of decision making in the parenting plan. And we're going to talk about, not in this episode, but in our next episode, we're going to talk about dispute resolution, which essentially means we have this joint decision that we're supposed to make jointly, but we don't agree. How to resolve it? And that's what your parenting plan dispute resolution section is for. And our next exciting multi-part series about parenting plan and creating parenting plans, we're going to dive into creating that dispute resolution section. And I can't wait, Meg, to get into this with you some more.
Gonna be good. Gonna be good.
So, Meg, if people need some help, some guidance, creating a co-parenting agreement for decision making, how can people get a hold of you?
Yeah, you can visit my website. It's meggluckman.com. My last name is Gluckman.com. And I have right now on my website too a PDF of 5 key questions to ask yourself before any co-parenting meeting or divorce meeting. And I have all of my clients use these 5 questions to kind of help them get grounded and settled and get clear on what their goals are for each meeting. So if anybody is struggling with co-parenting or in the beginning process of their divorce, I highly recommend you go grab those questions.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to look at those questions myself.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Meg. It's been a pleasure as always, and I can't wait to get into the next topic with you. And to all of our my listeners out there, thank you again for joining me on another episode of the Akiona Law Podcast, wherein we talk about anything and everything that intersects in the areas of family law and divorce. Until then, I am Ululani Akiona, collaborative divorce lawyer, family law mediator, and stay tuned and be well, folks. Thank you.
The information in this podcast is general advice only and should not in any respect be relied on as specific legal advice.